46. A couple people just joined. We could go ahead and start a little on time today instead of waiting our usual 5 minutes. So if I do that, I'll start with the opening page. This is our monthly Q&A meeting via Zoom, March 1st. I want to remind everybody we've got our Kansas honey producers meeting this weekend. And we have some awesome speakers, and Dr. Samuel Ramsey and Clarence Collison. Clarence has spoken to our state group before. Both of them are giving 2 presentations, and I think you might find Samuel Ramsey's interesting. He's the one that in the last couple of years came up with the discovery that the mites were feeding off fat bodies in honeybees instead of the hemolymph, which is the blood that insects, what we call the insect blood. So that was his discovery. And he's going to talk about drivers of honeybee colony losses and what the data actually says. And he's actually giving 2 talks, and the other will be on varroa management and how mites should be treated. And Clarence is giving a talk on the basics of honeybee biology, and also he's giving a second talk on spring preparations and assessment. So both of them are very timely. And if you just go to kansashoneyproducers.org, you can register for that. This was what I pulled off today, but it still hasn't changed from a couple of days ago. But the temperature outlook for prediction for the month of March, we're supposed to be in the above average range, and our average is 56 degrees, and we almost made that today. Right now it's 48, but I think we got up to 55, at least over my area. So if you're looking for some optimism, this is the Kansas bee table I've been trying to work on. Normally our maples bloom in February, but not this year. Found the first one today, so wasn't blooming yesterday, but there are chores to be done, stimulating the colonies, reversing brood chambers. It's what I usually do end of February, beginning of the month. So that's an example of the maple tree just starting to bloom. As a reminder, and this comes from Diane Samataro's handbook, the Beekeeper's Handbook is the title, 4th edition, and the temperatures for colony activity. Interesting to know that when it gets to -40, bees die, or clusters die. So hope we don't ever get that low, but it got down to -27 in Texas. We had a -8 here during that cold spell. So our first question, and probably I should introduce our officers. Our president's Ed Darlington. He's not with us this evening, but Steve Messbarger is our program chair. Cecil Sweeney is our librarian. Chad Gilliland is our honey plants. Our secretary is Janet Campbell. I'm the treasurer. Our youth scholarship chairman is Jolie Weiner. Military veteran liaison is Andy Nowacek, if he's made it on tonight. I know our editor, I see Cheryl, she's here. Our special events coordinator for B class is Becky Tipton, and let's give Becky a big hand. We just came through our second class. And we also have Joe Patrick, she's our special events coordinator for Fun Day. But our first question came from Patrick Wakeman, and he wrote, in reference to the use of dead outs to make splits, packages, and nukes, all deep frames are drawn with uncapped and capped honey, and he has some empty cells. So his question is, how many capped frames to the outside and what should go in the middle? And in time, add a second brood box. Should it have similar frames which are all drawn? And I don't have anybody in particular picked out for this question. Is there anybody that would like to jump in and comment? Any suggestions? He's asking for a little help.
Did he say he was installing a package?
I think it's possible it could be a split or a package or 5-frame nuke.
Well, Becky and I had a little talk about this. If we
Sure.
have time in our monthly meeting, we're gonna do a pros and cons on packages and nukes. I've had a lot of people call for nukes because they had dead outs, but if you have all the stuff, I think you're gonna be ahead of the game if you just get a package. I think we're all gonna be a little bit behind on everything. You might be able to get packages sooner than some of us can even get queens. So you, if it was me, it'd be the same setup as you find all summer long, couple of frames of pollen and brood on the 2 outside frames, and the rest should be brood frames. Your undrawn stuff. Wait till you have about 7 frames of bees in there and stick another box on. That would be that's about the easiest way, I guess. And the second box should be set up the same way, I believe. If you have those resources.
I would think that your only concern in doing that would be don't get ahead of the quantity of bees that you have. So if you're putting in a package, you're going to provide them with a couple frames of food and some empty frames for them to get started on. Don't jump the gun and then put a second box on top of it right away. They need a chance to really fill that out with brood. So if you're starting with a nuke, that's going to happen probably a little sooner, but save those frames. They, keep them safe, keep them protected. They aren't going to go bad, particularly in your freezer if you can put them there, but just don't get froggy and give your bees a whole lot more space than they can take care of. Does that make sense?
Wouldn't you say it's the same as when we install a package? When you get 7, 8 frames of bees
Yeah.
and brood, then put your second box on. That's
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
I guess that's the easiest way to tell. Just make sure your queen's working. Yeah.
Right. I think that addresses that one. I know there's a question in the chat box. And I think one is, how do you know when your hive is honey light? And when should I feed sugar solution and reverse deeps? And I think we may get to answer those questions as we go to a couple of the other ones in the program. So if you'll let me just proceed with that, we'll come back. This one came from Dan Hill. He wrote, I'm curious about the double screen dividers. I wanted to rewatch the presentation about nukes from the GPM Fun Day. I think it was presented by Mike Palmer, but can't find recordings. One of the main things I don't understand or missed is, number one, are there 3 queens in this setup? One in the parent colony on the bottom and one on each nuke above? I think he may be referring to where there was a deep box and there may have been 2 nukes sitting side by side, 5-frame nuke bodies on top of that colony, but I don't exactly remember looking at that. But is there somebody that attended the Great Plains Master
That's
Beekeeper
correct.
Fund?
There's one in the main and then his 2 nukes on top above the double screen with the divider, each have a queen. And the recording isn't out yet. When it is out, you'll get the link to it in an email. Right, you guys, I haven't seen.
Yes.
They
It takes a
said,
little while.
but they have to edit it and stuff, so it's not out yet, but you'll still get that, Dan.
Right.
I'm pretty sure that's what he was talking about when he had that.
And do the worker bees intermix with the multiple queens? A little bit, but not very much. Yeah, the screen on the bottom, they can't with the mother colony. But with the two with the divider, they could a little
I do have a
bit, but
headache, but I
not
also want to
really.
bring
Not much thought.
You guys, everyone mute yourself if you're not muted by Robert.
Well, I shoved it back in there.
We take,
Yeah,
we'll
you're-
take care of it here in just a
You're
second.
opening on your,
I'm sorry, Steve, if you will unmute yourself and start again.
yeah, just if you look at all those screens, their entrances are on opposite sides. So that's why you wouldn't have as much drifting into each one of them.
Great, thank you very much, Jolie and Steve. I'll move on to the next question. This came from Robin Wilson. Is it okay to put a new package of bees into a dead out hive with the same frames? Let's just take one of these questions at a time. I'll just comment by starting with, and Cheryl may jump in. We saw a presentation last week from an out-of-state bee group, and they were talking about viruses and how long they live in the combs. And so that was brand new information to us. Normally we'd say it's okay to put a new package into a dead hive with the same frames. And in that presentation, they were saying it was okay, but it seemed like it was only okay. Now they're discovering maybe some of the times, but Cheryl, would you like to add anything to that if you remember anything of it?
Well, they were saying that there's viruses in the dead out, and they were finding a high concentration of viruses. Not so much, I believe, in the brood frames necessarily, but they were saying that there was quite a bit of viruses passed in the honey, in the capped honey. So that was interesting.
Exactly. That's my recollection.
But do I have honey that I'm going to repurpose from a dead out? Yes. So I'll probably take my chances. But yeah, they were saying there's lots of times quite a bit of viruses in those.
Well,
Especially in-
how much does the cold affect the viruses though? I mean, we've had this super cold weather, and if this has been a dead out, it may have been through that cold spell.
Yeah.
You'd think they'd be froze out by now, or
Yeah. Well, the study's going to continue, so we'll get more information on that.
Hey,
That was
Rob,
interesting.
if that was a virus, but that came from the mites, but if your bees didn't die from, say they starved to death, but did they say anything about they would still have viruses or?
Yeah, they were talking like there still be viruses, whatever was in that colony. But like that, Marty says, what's the temperature threshold to kill the viruses in the hive? I don't know. It was just something they were talking about. I always repurpose my frames and my, as long as you don't have American foul brood or something.
so do I.
I think this is the perfect example of why we need to do more than just listen to our local bee club, because there's new stuff all the time. And go to those state meetings, go to those national meetings, because then we hear these speakers. At this time, that virus load question or concern is just a question mark. You know what? It could be an issue. It could be one of the things that we'll have to think about in the future. It's kind of right there on the periphery. We've always reused combs, but I think it's something that now we're going to think about a little bit more. What are we putting into this hive and what are we giving them? So again, I'd like to ask that question to Sam Ramsey at the KHPA meeting this weekend. I think Sam would be
a good question. Yeah.
the perfect person to pose that to. And he may not know the answer, but he sure as heck knows more than I do. So
Well, I mean, we throw frames away if we have a pesticide kill.
yeah.
We
Yeah.
we toss all those.
But we also we can't, as beekeepers, we can't see the virus.
Right.
That's the biggest issue.
Right.
It can be there, but we don't know it. It's hard for us to know. But I think the other question would be, can they fight off those viruses? A new colony.
Mhm.
Or maybe not give them the whole bunch of frames, maybe spread it through, so they only have 1 or 2 frames. Disperse them amongst other colonies, so it's a lower viral load.
Is it like us with a cold that, once you've had it a little bit, then you kind of develop some immunity to it? I don't know, but honestly, it's a great question. I would love to personally invite everyone that's here tonight to go to plan Saturday, spend Saturday with a lot of us. Come to the Kansas Honey Producers Zoom meeting, because you don't get to hear people like Clarence and Sam and the other people that we have. You just don't get to hear them all the time and get to ask them questions. It's
Mhm.
yeah, I think would be money and time really well spent. Not much money, that's for sure. So, and my last question, are we to the third question yet about sugar board? What does epic fail mean? It would be-
Yeah. Well, number 2 was, his question was, should I replace the foundation, or can the new bees use the pulled out wax from the old bees?
Oh.
That
Unmute.
question is, yeah. And also, how do we feed when the temperature is way below freezing? But let's do
No, it's not.
the replacement foundation part.
It is, because I was.
It depends. If that's good quality comb, it's not too old, yes, you can reuse it and the new bees will take it. But if it's really old, you probably want to rotate that out so it'd be on a rotational program. Even if it has dead bees in it, you may not be able to get the dead bees out, but if if they're in the cells, butts hanging out, it's still reusable. It just depends on the quality, but it's an opportunity.
Who are you then?
If you're getting a package and, syrup it up.
You're not muted.
And how do we feed when the temperature is way below freezing?
See, if I talk, it'll.
I still feed syrup. We'll answer that. I'll give a few
Hey,
demonstrations. on
Robert,
here.
can you mute everyone again?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. There, then unmute yourself when you want to talk. So thanks, Joey. Yeah, so I mean, it's not cold all the time, and this year we went through that short period, but other people use sugar cakes, fondant, got different methods, different philosophies. So somebody else would you like to address? I know Steve uses sugar cakes, and
I don't get, I tried a sugar board this winter and it was an epic fail. What failed? I don't,
yeah.
does anybody know what that?
Yeah, Robin, are you on here that you could tell us what didn't work?
If your
Yeah.
bees-
Yeah, all the bees died. So I assumed it was because they starved. And well, I know it's because they starved. And I did something wrong with the feeding. And I don't know what I did.
Were your bees up to the top box? Had your bees moved clear up to the top box?
No,
So
They
they
were
weren't,
still on the bottom box?
they were still on the bottom box. So I put the board on the bottom box and then put the cover over it.
You put the candy board in between the two boxes?
Yeah, I did.
No, we've never done that.
Well, I don't think I'll do it again.
The way I do it is when I do an inspection in the winter time, if my bees aren't at the top, right, there, you'll see them. If I take a flashlight and look in between the frames, if my bees are in the bottom box, then I look at the frames right above them. If they're full of honey, then there's nothing else I can do for them. But when my bees move to the top and it's going to be real cold, that's when I put the candy on top of them. That's
you.
how, I don't know, somebody else, that, everybody else has probably a different thing.
Yeah, I think I've got some other pictures showing some, you know, the way I do liquid feeding later on. So, but yeah, it's important that if, when you do that, at least that they're in contact with it. If they're not in contact with it, then they're not going to get to it. So,
Thanks.
Krista Clemmy wrote, I need to build new stands for 2 hives. I want to use the resources that I have on hand, which are cinder blocks with holes. She's got different sizes. I do have square foot posts too, and I may consider those in the plans as well. I've seen many ideas. Does anyone have a good pointer on the best way to stack 2 high holes on the side? Do you put them up and down, or do you use the post? I want to do this just once and avoid a wish I had thought of that before I started moment. All ideas are greatly appreciated. I just pulled a few pictures. Those are the feeders, but let's see, where'd my stands go? So here are the stands that I used in the presentation. You can use, these are, Krista, just a couple different ideas. The lower left one there, you can see is using cinder blocks. The wooden stand right above it, I think is too low to the ground. I wouldn't put it directly on the ground, but you could arrange cinder blocks and use something like that. Or you could build your own. There are a couple other stands. This one, the next picture in the lower left corner, I kind of like. It's interesting. Get your husband out there to help you put something together. Are you on, Krista? I think she is. She's on her phone, but she may not be able to voice in. But at any rate,
I just would like to say, we see a lot of new beekeepers making their first stands too high, so that once you get a couple boxes on, you like can't reach in there. You either have to lift stuff up real high. And so while you do have to get it up off the ground, you don't want to make it so high that it's unmanageable, I guess.
yeah, and you don't want it too low either, because critters like mice can get into it. So it's I think there's an organic site, and they recommend having it 8 inches or higher off the ground. So 2 cinder
Also-
blocks would be good enough. And the problem, I think, with cinder blocks is that the ground softens up when it warms up, or we get a lot of rain in a wet area, and then it begins to get lopsided. So you have to watch out for that.
Also, you're going to want to make sure your hive stand is tilted forward slightly so that the water runs out of your hive.
Yes.
And then a lot of new beekeepers I see, they tend to not leave enough room around their hives to work them from either side. So make sure you have plenty of room wherever you set up your hive to be able to access it from both sides in the back.
That's Christy Sanderson. Thank you, Christy. I just want to put on here, there are different types of feeders. And so I just put this in here for information. We've got jar and bucket feeders. We have division board feeders. We have top feeders. Some of these are seasonal and you can't use them when it's really cold, but they work well, 6 months, 8 months out of the year. So those are just the types of feeders.
Robert, can I jump in and ask a question there real quick? You guys have all talked about the 5-gallon bucket feeders quite a bit, and I'm trying to understand how that works, because forgive me, because I don't know how those work. How do you actually feed the bees with a 5-gallon bucket?
We don't. I think we use a 1-gallon bucket.
So, but what do you, you don't poke holes in the bucket, right?
No, but like this bucket here that's in the picture that's up to the upper left corner, it comes with the hole in it. And it's got a screen that's glued into it.
So that's actually a special feeder. It's not just a bucket that you're
No,
putting
it's a
inside of a
bucket.
wooden box.
It's a bucket. We
Okay.
just turn it upside down, and the syrup comes out of it a little bit, But then the suction holds the rest of it in. You put it over the inner cover or on top of the frames, and the bees will actually come up and take the syrup out of the bucket with their
Thank you.
tongues.
Where where do you get the lids from? Because those obviously are special lids. You just order those from any beekeeping outlet? Okay.
So some of the bee supply dealers have them. I think this came from that veterans group in Manhattan, the ones I have personally, but you can probably get them out of Dadant or Man Lake.
Okay. I apologize for jumping in, but you brought it up and I've really been dying to find that out. Thank you.
Nope, glad you did. Thank you.
When we used these, it had a plug in here, and the plug had a few little holes in it. So it just acted again. It was that suction feeder. You have to make sure that this lid is on perfectly.
Yep.
If it's not, and you don't create that suction, you're just going to pour a gallon of syrup right all over your bees, and that won't be good. I don't like the ones with the screen because we think they feed too fast. But if it has the plug in it, then it goes a lot slower, and it works okay. It's a good way to feed.
And don't fill the bucket all the way up, right?
Yeah,
Good
mostly I do.
suggestion.
Same way with the jar.
Same way with the jar. But you want to get the ratio right. In the fall and winter, we feed 2 to 1, and that's by weight, not by volume. And so in the springtime, like right now that the maples opened up today, I would start to feed 1 to 1. And that's the reason is stimulation versus actual feeding to make it through the winter time. So if you think it's going to get too cold if you're using an inverted jar or a bucket, put a towel or an old t-shirt on top of it. But it works fine. It can freeze. If you've got them on right now, it could go all the way down to 10 and it will not freeze. But if your bees are at the top, they need to be fed. If you're stimulating or they're starving, do something like that. So next question came from Jay Francis. He said, yesterday I was in my hives and typically I was seeing the top box moderately heavy with resources and the bottom box light with few or no bees. I reversed the boxes and switched out the fondant for syrup. Because I'm feeding from the top, haven't I just created a void between the bees and the syrup? Cheryl, you had a good frame showing on your presentation about reversing.
Yeah. I like to feed a little bit of syrup before I reverse. Just so they can take the syrup where they need it, where they're raising brood. And I typically like to just, stimulatory feed for a quart or so and then reverse the hive bodies. Because yes, theoretically you have created a void, but usually if they have enough, position your honey frames around that brood cluster. When you reverse hive bodies, hopefully you've moved some resources next to them. And we're not going to hopefully be in another deep cold snap like we have been. And they'll be able to go up and access that on the warmer times of the day. So hopefully he's got, a little bit of honey frames he can put around them in the bottom box. But we don't usually have that long of cold spells for very long. They'll cluster in the evening and they'll be out walking around again during the day.
Basically, you're just reversing. If your cluster is occupying both boxes, you don't want to reverse it. But if they're mostly in the top and you're reversing and putting it to the bottom, then your empty combs are going to be above them. They'll move and grow a lot quicker because heat rises. And so that's typical of what we do this time of year, or at least what I do. And you're, giving them the ability to grow faster. Thanks, Cheryl. Next was also from Jay Francis. He said, with regards to baiting of swarms, so swarm season's in about 7 to 8 weeks, 6 weeks. The presenter said to put some frames with no foundation in the baited hive to simulate space. When I asked about it, he said he wanted them to build wax because they were so good at wax building. I think this was one of our, was it the Great Plains Master presentation?
I think he's talking about Noah
Okay.
Summers and what he talked about.
At our class on Saturday. So his question was, why would you want the bees to build comb without foundation in your hive? I would want to use their wax building energy to build lots of empty frames with foundation so they can be used in that hive or reused in other hives possibly. Maybe I misinterpreted what he was saying.
I thought Noah was using starter strips.
I think he was
Yes.
too. Yeah.
He was using one old piece of comb for his first frame. No, make sure there's no honey on it. And then I think he was
So-
using an empty one. Becky, wasn't he using an empty one with foundation that was waxed? And then he had a couple of starter strips.
I do think so. And I think the research he was referring to, now I can't think of, they're going to go into a cavity and they're going to fly around and measure that cavity. And if you have a lot of frames in there, they won't perceive it as much space, is the thought, as if you have just put in some starter strips. Yes, they're going to draw wax like crazy. So I guess the best way to do that then would be catch your swarms fast. As soon as they start building in there, get them into your box with your foundation. That is what Noah said. I do think it was contradictory. I think it was confusing, but I think that that's what he's referring to. I think that's what he wants you to do, is say the starter strips should get them building so they're not doing a lot of cross comb. It should make it better. I don't like foundationless frames. I don't want to do top bar. I don't want any of that because they break so easily. So man, if you're going to put a hive, a trap hive up like that, I think what Noah said, the starter strips would be positive towards getting bees to move in. But I think you better get them into your equipment and your frames and your boxes as soon as possible. I think that would be the choice to do.
And
But
I-
that's
Yeah, Becky?
And
think
I
he did
found
say-
that the same.
He also has
It,
a little
it
wire.
works, the starter strips work in an old frame of old comb. It does work. And like Becky said, if you get it fast enough, they're still gonna draw those out, but the frames make it so that you can transfer that into a hive and then put your foundation in there, your frame foundation, and you might have a couple of frames of without any foundation, but comb. That's just part of the game. Same way with a cutout. You won't have foundation. You'll have comb strapped into the frames. And that's how I started doing it, because Noah's done several of our meetings before. And that's exactly what he talks about. If you don't, when you take the lid off your swarm trap, the comb's going to be all on top of that lid. And when you pull that up, it all breaks off. So keep 5 frames in there. And the starter strip is just an inch of the wax strip glued in with wax on each frame.
Yeah, I like to use foundation too, especially on swarms. Thank you. So Josh Toole wrote, we tore apart our dead hive this weekend and just wanted to confirm in your opinion what the potential cause was. We had 2 deeps. The bottom had 4 empty brood frames and the outside frames were honey. The top box was full of honey except for the 2 middle frames, which both had a small portion of empty with a small cluster of dead bees. We used the 2 treatments of Apogard in the fall for mite treatment, but did not do a mite count after treatment. We really need to learn how to do that. And Jolie, if you might talk about your experience with Apogard. He did send us a few pictures, and so we'll take a look at the pictures here too.
Yeah, so those look like really little clusters. And we had the same thing. We treated early, the last of July or beginning of August, and we used, oh, we didn't use Apogard, we used Apovar, the strips, the fluvalinate strips, and that it did not work. It didn't touch our mites at all. And by the time we realized it, we'd had a horrible mite infestation. We retreated with something else, and so our bees went into winter with pretty small clusters.
Yeah.
So I would not spend money on Apovar. We wound up spending money on 2 different things, making it very expensive, and it really cost our hives a lot. So
Isn't Apovar Amitraz, not fluvalinate?
Amitraz, yeah. But don't use fluvalinate either, so.
Oh, that one's bad too, so yeah.
Let me look here. So this picture was interesting because when he sent it to us and we looked at it, Cheryl and I both found it right away. But what do you see on that bee right there?
I see a mite.
And there's one there. And these are dead bees. They froze.
Mm-hmm.
So the
And
mites
here's
froze too.
mites. I mean, there's bees without wings and stuff. So
Yeah.
you can tell that you had, if you can see mites on bees, you have a horrible infestation. So
Yeah. So that may have been what caused the population to dwindle so much. But those were the mites that we found. There might have been some.
I don't think Apogard was a great treatment this year. For some reason, it didn't work very well. I don't know.
I think it was almost imperative that you did a cleanup with oxalic acid when they were broodless, whether you chose to do sublimation or a dribble. But I think we even had bees that were still putting out brood in December. I mean, we were seeing orientation flights. Joe even mentioned that in early December. So I'm not sure we always caught them all totally broodless, but it's better than nothing.
So is anybody going to treat this spring with Apogard or anything like that? Anybody?
I don't usually treat in the spring, so.
I think you need to test your mite levels before you treat.
Yeah.
That should make your determination, not a yes or no from the gate.
Yeah.
Robert, it's,
Yeah.
oh, sorry. Am I seeing what looks like mite feces all over? I'm seeing white dots. Is that
Nope.
mite feces?
I
Oh.
think like down in,
Yes, on the bees themselves.
yeah, there might be like clusters, crumbs from the comb, I think. Like in this area and that area.
Yes. Uh-huh.
I mean, because there's some wax right there.
yeah, maybe some robber bees have gotten in there since then and torn some of the wax out, because you would see feces down in the cells, Joe.
Joe, I
Okay.
think if you look clear over here on the far left side, right here, and I like 2 cells in and about halfway down, right in here someplace, that might be feces on the inside of the cell, but that's, from a picture, it's just hard to tell.
Yes, yes. I agree. Thank you.
So dead mites are good mites. This came in from Brenda Muntz. Someone spoke of repurposing a queen. What does that mean? And I'm not sure if that was from this weekend's class.
That was
That
Cheryl.
was probably me.
I'm sorry, who?
It was probably my wording.
Okay,
When
Cheryl.
I don't pinch queens. I don't kill queens very often unless they're drone laying and they've run out of sperm. But sometimes I will not use them as in a production hive. as the head queen in my honey producing hives. If she's an older second year queen, I may put her in a nuke, and I may use her as a resource hive where I'll swipe bees and brood from her during the season to support my production colonies. But I can always use her if I need to. I could newspaper her to a colony that has become queenless or something, and I could use her to fix a lot of other issues with other colonies. So I call it repurposing your queen. That might not be the best terminology, but you don't always have to run a full size 20 frame colony. You can use them as resource colonies. So.
Thank you. And Christy just mentioned about testing for mites. Would you like to talk about, can I treat for mites in the spring, and do I want to?
Sure. In the spring, I like to do the powdered sugar test to see what my mite levels are. You take 300 bees and 2 tablespoons of powdered sugar, and you put them in a jar. You want to take those bees off of the frames that have open brood on them, and take your jar and put the lip of the jar on the frame so that you're pulling that jar downward so the bees fall off into your jar. Before you do this, of course, you want to check for your queen, make sure your queen's not on that frame. You don't want to roll her in the powdered sugar. But once you have your bees and your sugar in your jar, you want to let that sit at least 2 minutes so those bees will heat up. They react to the powdered sugar, and then the mites can't hang on their bodies. You'll then want to shake that jar over something white like a paper plate, and shake the powdered sugar, and any mites that are there will shake out with the powdered sugar. And then you can spritz it with some water and the mites will show up. If I find 3 to 5 mites in that test, then that's when I'll treat with something in the spring. If I find less than 3 mites, then I don't treat.
Thank you. What does butts out mean, and do I start with contact feeders in the spring? It's really a separate question, but butts out.
You got a picture?
I don't know if I put one in here or not. Those aren't
Picture I
really-
used was from Cheryl. So good. Now that one's, she's got a really good heads in, butts out picture.
Yeah, I thought
On my phone, not my computer.
I thought I put one in there, but I didn't.
Let me see if I can share. I've got one.
Basically, their heads are in the cell, so all you see is their
Mhm.
back ends sticking out at you because they're in a dry cell and they've starved. Yeah,
Can
there
you-
you go.
Can you see it?
Yes. That's butts
All
out.
you get are just, and that's the classic, this hive starved. That's what you're looking at. So, all right.
Are you done?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I quit sharing.
Took Robert out.
I didn't mean to do that, Robert. Let's see. Some good conversations in the chat box, but okay, good, moving on.
Robert, are you muted?
Thank you. Hi. The next question was, what is a hive reversal? When do you do this and why? And I think Jim Kelly might be on if he's tuning in. out in central Kansas. I'm not sure if he does this or not, but Jim, are you there?
I
Probably.
am here.
Do you do hive reversals?
We used to a long time ago. We no longer do that now. We try to get them to where they build up pretty fast and we use them to split. The main thing about a hive reversal is don't do it unless you need to. For starters, some people reverse them when they're full of brood at the top and the bottom. And you're really just cutting the hive in half and actually slowing it down. The other thing is the reversal also has to chime with the weather that's going on outside. Remember, when you're pulling that up, there is probably not much but some very little brood at all, if any, there. And there is some pollen probably up there, but that's about it. And so if you get into a cold snap, the bees will want to travel up and they can't. So we try to also make that work so that it's above 50 degrees or so in the nighttime as well, so that we don't have that issue. Then the bees will jump right up and begin to join it. So you've got to have reverse for a reason. There's got to be the bottom box is going to be full of brood and ready to be reversed. So you kind of got to do all three of those at the same time, but it's been a long time now since we've done any reversing.
And Jim's one of our biggest honey producers in the state, I believe.
What?
Was. He's retiring, kind of.
Well, yeah, I've gone down quite a little ways, so I'm pretty close to between a hobbyist and a sideliner now, so that's good. I have more time to work the bees.
Yay, retirement. Cheryl has a good slide. Maybe we'll address that at another time too, on when to reverse and when not to. You do not want to split a cluster that's between both boxes if you do a reversal, and that's for sure. So,
hey, Robert, before
Yes.
you move to the next slide, would you tackle the second part of question number 3?
do I start with contact feeders in the spring? I would say yes, because the other type of feeders are not going to be in contact with the clusters. And if the cluster's not big enough or you can't get it close enough to them, they're not going to take that food. And I had experience with somebody that was out not too far from the farm out in Paola. They put the top feeders on and they were feeding them this time of year, and it was just too cold. And they actually, one of the colonies we looked at was right starving, in the middle of starvation, and half of them were already dead. And they had lots of syrup in there, and they were wondering why they weren't taking it down. Well, the different types of feeders aren't going to be effective in cold weather, so you can't use them all year round. So that's my input on it. Did that help? And that's all I do is contact feeding right now, if I am feeding. Anybody else want to chime in? No?
I might just follow up on that question of, so is a contact feeder one that drops right down in by the frames?
No. Contact feeder, for example, is like this inverted jar where you've got it right in contact with the bees.
Okay.
So contact feeding is where it's accessible in cool and cold weather. It's better for emergency type feeding. If you're going to do it with the jar or a bucket, you need an empty box. When we talk about rapid feeding, it's ideal for like when you get a package, and you can use these other types of, a frame feeder, a division board feeder, or this top feeder. You can use those in warm weather, but if your cluster's to the right side of the hive and your feeder's over to the left side of the hive and it's not big enough, they're only going to go over there when the weather gets warm enough for them to break cluster, which is in the mid 50s and higher. So it doesn't always happen that way in the wintertime. Does that help? Okay. And I think that's it. And this is just a reminder of our Kansas Honey Producers meeting. If you can make it, sure hope you get a lot of good information from it. So, okay. And that's it for the written questions.
Well, there's a bunch of questions in the chat box if you want to run through and see if there's any people didn't answer that we didn't answer.
Sure, I'll start from the top. This one came, it says, with it warming up in the next few days, I would like to open my hive and see how they're doing. What am I looking for? Jolie, would you like to answer? Or Cecil?
Cecil's talking. You.
I'm
Talk.
sorry.
Oh, gosh.
There, you're back.
And the main thing is, okay, main thing is look for food stores still. That's going to be part of your concern. If it warms up enough to where the bees are really flying, you could pull a couple frames out and so that look just to see if you have brood in that hive, but I wouldn't do any long time inspections quite yet, because it's going to be in the 50s, but still it's a little cool to have hives open for a long time. But yeah, just look to see where the bees are and if they still have enough food and do you need to feed.
If they're way over to one side, you might want to center them up and make sure you have honey on both sides of them. But that's about all we do right now.
Yeah, it's important. Normally we don't do inspections like pulling out frames unless it's in the 60s. Mid 60s is better than the lower 60s. But next question is from Brenda. If a hive is absconded or swarmed and they're gone and there's honey in the frames, can we safely extract that honey? Cheryl, what would you do?
On an absconded swarm,
Or if they died out?
my first question would be, did they treat?
Yeah, exactly.
Did they treat for mites?
And the brood comes.
Yeah.
Depends on what you've used as a mite treatment. If it's anything but oxalic acid, I wouldn't use it for human consumption. But you could extract it and use it for
Could you
bee feed
talk-
at some point.
Could you talk about the new rules on oxalic? That's cutting edge news. That's big stuff.
So it's still not official yet, but the EPA is approved. The discussion, I think, ends in a week or two. The discussion is around the use of oxalic acid with all during year-round situations where you may have honey supers on. So that's what's coming down the pipeline. Next question I have is Susan Cummings. If you place the frames in the freezer, would that kill the viruses?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think we know yet.
Yeah, we don't know yet.
That's a question for the guys on Saturday.
Hopefully Becky wrote it down so she'll ask. Michael from Barrington says, my neighbor has a dead out and I may be able to get the comb. If I melt it down into blocks, will that kill any viruses? Unless American foul brood killed that colony, that is. Cheryl, since you kind of addressed that, would you like to mention that again? Oops.
Unmute Cheryl.
You really need to know your beekeeper well, and you know, if it's got American foul brood, there's no way you're gonna rid the colony of that. The spores will stay in for 70+ years. If the combs aren't that old, you could reuse them if you really wanted to use those combs. I wouldn't do any melting down or anything and repurposing it that way, unless you were just gonna use the wax for like candles or something. But if you want to reuse those frames, is that what he's wanting to do? Just reuse the friends?
It sounds like it.
That
But I would
out?
also add that it's important to know the difference between viruses and bacteria, and American
Right.
foul brood and European foul brood are bacteria diseases.
Right. Yeah, American foul brood's a bacteria.
Yeah. And I think if you melted your wax, it would kill any virus that are in the, potential combs.
Won't kill the spores on bacterial. foul.
Right. Dwayne's asking, let's see, but how do you know that your package doesn't have the virus? Seems a lot to worry. We're learning, Dwayne. But, everything, there are viruses everywhere. As you know, coronavirus is one. I don't know. Anybody want to address that at all? Depends on the virus. Most of the virus transmission that we're having problems with have to do with the mites biting and spreading them to the bees. So we've all got mites, we've all got that kind of problem. So some of those questions have been answered. So let's see. Amber Wendell mentioned that they use recycled tires for a couple of their hives as a stand. Someone's asking, why shouldn't you use a top feeder in cold weather? I think we addressed that. Dana Gettle was asking, you feed your bees even if they have frames of honey available? And Dana, that would depend on your purpose for feeding. Are you just trying to stimulate them or wake them up for the spring? It depends on how big your cluster is and how close they are to the food source. Anybody else want to talk about that? Chime in.
I think it's just another one of those things, Robert, like we just did. It's not hard and fast. It isn't like this is the rule. This is always the rule. It's March 1st, therefore feed your bees. What do you want to do? Where are you wanting to split this colony? If you want to split this colony, then a light feeding might help stimulate that queen. But if you feed heavily, they might just pack the brood nest full of syrup and have no place for the queen to lay. So you have to really look at why, how much food is in there, why you want to feed, what your hive is doing, the weather, the everything else, and then make that decision. So do we feed? Usually, because we usually have equipment we want to fill, but I wouldn't think everybody does. So.
Yeah, it's livestock. I wouldn't feed just to feed. I would feed with purpose. If you're trying to prevent them from starving, you want to feed them to save them. If you want to stimulate them to grow, tell them to get the queen laying more eggs. You want to feed them for that purpose. So, but don't just feed to feed and know when to stop feeding. I think that was one of the problems that Christy had mentioned a couple of years ago, that in her observations that she sees more new beginners overfeeding and not knowing when to stop. And as one of the problems that she runs into. Right, Christy?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, it's just like you've been saying, feed with a purpose. Don't feed just because you think it's the right thing to do. You'll plug out the brood nest and they'll fill it in with syrup and there'll be no room for your queen to lay, so they'll think they're overcrowded and swarm.
All kinds of tricks to it. Let's see, Michael's adding to this earlier question. He said he would be using the comb or those frames with starter strips. He's going to try top bar hive with no foundation. If he gets his comb from the person who had the dead out, that he understands they'll have to see if it's worth using. He doesn't know how old it is, so he's not committed yet. He's just thinking out loud. Brian has mentioned that Better Bee sells bucket feeders, and so does Golden Prairie Farms, which is a lot closer than Better Bee, but either one works. And Sheldon was mentioning that he gets buckets from Price Chopper or restaurants and drills 1/8 inch holes in them just below the cupped lid. But that's probably the 5-gallon buckets. And who mentioned that earlier, I forgot. They're probably talking about the open feeding, which I, for one, don't recommend open feeding. And I don't think Becky
I don't
does
recommend
either.
open feeding either.
Don't do it.
Yeah, don't do it. We used to have it in our Constitution, in the Northeast Constitution, not to feed open feed bees and spread viruses and that kind of thing, because that's one way you can spread disease. So I forgot.
I've seen a lot of people putting on that they're open feeding pollen. And I mean, I think that's crazy too, don't you guys?
Yeah, especially in our area where we live.
Yeah, I mean, if you're gonna feed it, put it inside the hive,
it
just like you
inside,
would
I mean-
liquid feed.
What I have read is that it does not seem to incite them to robbing as open feeding does, that it isn't that kind of a frenzy. But at, at the same time, our hives are so rarely pollen poor that I don't know that that's a necessary tactic. It's kind of interesting to watch them, but no, I don't, no, you don't need to.
But it's also a good way to spread disease and
I would think that's probably true.
and for
open feeding.
varroa bombing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, even feeding pollen. So I don't openly.
Yeah, I think that that's probably not been looked at as much. It's not as big a practice, but certainly don't open feed, don't open feed, don't open feed. It's just.
Thank you. Well, Krista Henry had a comment. She took a look in her hive today, and most of the bees were covering about 7 frames in the bottom box. She used a flashlight, like Steve had suggested, and the top box had bees, not a lot, but most frames in the top box were still full of honey. And she's asking, why have they not eaten the honey?
They haven't needed it.
Maybe they're on a spring diet, they started in January.
So good, it's better to have too much than not enough.
Yeah. They'll eat it.
They'll eat it. They'll be going through a lot here, Krista, with this warm up and the building up with their, brood for the
Yeah,
spring.
their feed buildup's probably about 2 weeks behind too, if not more, with our weather we've had.
Yeah,
So
and that is it. We are behind at least a couple weeks. Usually we have pollen coming in mid-month, so when the maples open, and it's just now happening. So
they'll start consuming a lot of resources now that they start brood rearing.
And especially if it stays warm like it's supposed to.
Yeah.
I'd like to quote Jim Kelly. He wrote this in, I think it was a Facebook post this last week. And somebody said, how much honey should my hive have? Where should I be concerned? Because we know as they go into spring that they can start consuming some real big quantities. I mean, you start brood rearing and all this. And Jim Kelly, who's on here, if I misquote you, please speak up. He said that kind of an average size hive will use a frame of honey in about 2 weeks if they have no brood, and in about 1 week if they have brood. Now, this is assuming that, these guys get kind of shut in. Maybe they're not a lot of forage available, so they're not that constantly going out, getting some more, bringing it in, using that. So if your bees get shut up in the spring because we have a week of rainy weather, that's how quickly they can go through their stores. Did I say that about right, Jim Kelly?
Yes, ma'am, you're right on target.
I try to quote the best.
Thank you. Mike Katzby had a comment. He's saying, and this is referring to your cluster size, softballs have a hard time in winter and basketballs have more success. And boy, isn't that true, especially when it's really cold. Jay said, I found tweezers work well for removing dead bees from cells. Tap frame to expose them and then use the tweezers. It takes some time, but it works. And I think Becky was showing where they were using a bee blower, or was that Jolie and Cecil?
Steve uses compressed air.
Compressed air.
Like he has an air tank and a little wand that he will kind of blow the bees out with, but it's just, no matter what, it's gross and disgusting.
Thank you. Jim Putnam made a comment. I used Apigard after honey supers were removed and was not happy with the results after testing. Luckily, I had time for several OA treatments. And I think, Jim, everybody's experienced some sort of problem with everything last year. So, and I believe looking for more. Amber Wendell's commenting, our bees are finding the cows, sheep, cracked corn again, feeding lately in the warm weather. Yes, and even bird feeders, they'll go after that. So. I think that's about it. Has anyone in the club, and this is from Dave Schedule, ever tried a Turn-Off split? And I can say, Dave, personally, I have not. I don't even know what that is. I've never heard of it before.
Neither.
Turn-Off.
Where it's where you have a hive that you've come in and you've seen the queen, the old queen is still in there and they have swarm preparations. And so the thought is that you let the bees decide if they want to stay home or if they were going to swarm with the old queen, and they have this little ramp and you shake or brush frame by frame by frame outside the hive. Well, most of your nurse bees have never been outside the hive. So they tend to stay on the board and they end up clustering on the underside of the board, and they don't go in where all your forager bees will fly back in the entrance. And they put this ramp and they leave a couple inch gap between the ramp and the front of the hive. Seems like a lot of work to split a colony. If you get in a colony and you have the old queen and you have capped swarm cells, why not just walk off with the old queen and do a reverse split than to do a Taranov split? Jim, have you ever heard of this? Am I way off base on that?
No, I think that's about what they talk about. And it basically sounds like someone that really doesn't know a lot about the young nurse bees and that type of thing. There's several people that have named things after themselves, and I think this is just
well, basically they do that, and you get a split with the old queen and a bunch of nurse bees, and then the old parent colony has all the swarm cells and all these foragers. So you know in a true swarm you get foragers, nurse bees, and you get all all the different, not just, the Tarnob method to me wouldn't be very good. Because
The other part-
you'd have that old colony with waiting on a queen to emerge, and I mean they'd have all the cat brood frames, I guess, but you'd have all these foragers. They'd have to go back to resort back to their old roles. To me, it would be probably more stressful for the old parent colony. I don't know.
One of the things that happens with that is a lot of times when we're splitting colonies, we're in Texas, we have to be careful with that situation because all the old bees are out flying around
Right.
and back to the original hive. And the old bees really don't do well when it comes to accepting a new queen or queen cell. And so your average is going to go way down. So that's why I'm just not really sure that a person probably means very well what they're doing, but it's just not a really good way to do it.
Great, thank you. Well, it's almost a quarter after. It's 12 after for sure. So I appreciate everybody joining us tonight. We had at least almost 70, I saw, 69.
I'm going to interrupt just for a second because down below that question, there's about 4 or 5 people who ask about the oxalic acid. Could you revisit that real quick before we go?
Okay, thank you. So a lot of our mite treatments we are able to use on our colonies, but we're not allowed or supposed to be able to use them during a honey flow with honey supers on. There are a couple exceptions. HopGuard is one, and I believe the other is formic acid, but those are the only two. And now the EPA is making a decision that it will be possible to use oxalic acid during a honey flow with honey supers on, that it won't contaminate the honey. But it's not a final decision yet, so it's still coming down the pipeline. But it's great news because it means you might be able to use it. However, I think there are some drawbacks, like your colony's too big. It's not effective when you have a lot of brood, which is what we have during, the honey season. So, but it means it's not going to poison you. Does that help? Anybody else want to comment?
Yeah, isn't that what they said about Roundup? So, you can do whatever you want, but we sell our honey and I refuse to treat when I have honey supers on. I can honestly tell people that we do not put anything in that hive when we have our honey supers on. But, those are choices you make. I'm not for sure FDA and the EPA are the best choices we've got sometimes. So, but each his own, I guess.
Well, it means if you'd been doing it, it won't be illegal once they approve it.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah. You did it legally. You killed somebody legally.
Except that what I read today is if you use just wood bleach like you get from the hardware store, that is still illegal because it is not marked to be used in the hive, and that you must, if you want to be truly legal, you have to buy the product that is labeled for use in beehives. And
Correct.
so honestly, the EPA are busy. They're not coming out to check you, but you do what you think is best. But now, and we knew all along, oxalic acid is in honey in minute quantities. It wasn't a problem, but we've just got another step closer to it being another tool, another tool.
Yeah, thank you, Becky. And it's not the only food. We consume a lot of root vegetables, beets, carrots. It's in nuts. It's in spinach, dark green vegetables. Lots of berries have it. So it's a product that we, consume already. But
But you still shouldn't abuse it, is the point.
Exactly.
And at what level is in your honey versus the other foods that we have.
Well, that's what they're saying, is that it doesn't increase the level that's already in there. It does for a short time temporarily, but it goes back down to normal. So,
And Brenda, to answer your question, you can still use those frames of honey. If you catch a swarm or make a nuke, you can still use it in your hive. You just, some of us don't think you should consume it, so.
yeah, I never take honey from brood boxes, if that helps.
And I guess the other thing is, how old is that comb? Because it does absorb all kinds of stuff, so. But
Yeah, we should close out. Several of us did wax samples a couple years ago that were sent off to the big labs, and it was very interesting to find out how many poisons they found in our wax sampling. And it, you know, from pesticides, herbicides, the miticides that we use in the colonies, even things that I haven't used in years, still showed up. So, and they were cleaner. Jim Kelly probably has cleaner comb than we do in the suburbs.
That actually was what I was about to mention, Robert, because I got the whole gist of that because I had to give a report on that. And what they found was, I think we had like 34 different components in our frames, and those that were in the urban areas had over 70, which really surprised me.
Yeah, that surprised me too.
Well, Robert, another thing too was, well, like, I don't know if you said it or Steve said it or someone mentioned it. If you're going to treat oxalic acid when the honey is on, you're going to have a lot larger bee population. So it's going to be very hard to cover, you know, get more of the bees treated or whatever. So it's not going to be as effective even with the honey on, even if it doesn't hurt the honey, you know. So I still prefer to do it in the early spring or late fall or whatever, you know, and I use a vaporization method, but you know, it's still, you know, I think it's better when there's less honey on or less bees in there. So.
I also can't think of any reason why you would want to. I mean, unless you were going in and doing mite loads and all that. But usually when our supers are on, unless we think we have a problem, they're on their own.
Nope. Yeah. Well, I think it's almost 20 after. That should be our program for tonight. Thanks, everybody. If you haven't had dinner, go get it now. One last comment. Mike Catsby saw a Chicago webinar that showed urban lead content was double the content in suburban honey. So, yuck. Okay.
I thought mine weighed a little more than it usually does. Okay, I'm leaving. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks. Nice evening. See you at the Monday meeting, March 15th.
Right.
Bye.